Hi there. On the 23rd of February 2002, state-owned television in Luanda, the capital of Angola, displayed the lifeless body of rebel leader Jonas Savimbi. In the poor neighbourhoods of Luanda, residents erupted into spontaneous acts of celebration, sounding their car horns and lighting up red flares. The day before, on Friday, the 22nd of 2002, in the early hours of the morning, Jonas Savimbi had sat down for breakfast on the banks of the Lavuei River near the town of Lucesse. A detachment of special forces who had been tracking Savimbi for over 6 months opened fire and killed Savimbi. A few months before, in August of 2001, deep within the Central Highlands of Angola, Savimbi had convened a conference of UNITA top military commanders. He acknowledged to his lieutenants that he had made mistakes in the past, an admission that was astonishing given Savimbi's reputation for convincing his commanders that he was infallible and incapable of making any errors. However, it seems that throughout his career, beginning as a young nationalist in the early 1970s, Jonas Savimbi had been marked by the tendency to align with the wrong allies in his pursuit for power. To his admirers in the affluent Western world, Savimbi was variously described as a freedom fighter, a democrat, and even hailed as one of the authentic heroes of our time. In contrast to those who suffered from his armed struggle, Savimbi was seen as a tyrant and a warlord who transformed vast areas of resource-rich Angola into some of the most miserable places on earth. His relentless pursuit of power and desire to reside in the presidential palace in Luanda plunged the rural regions of southern Angola into starvation, hunger, and disease. Join me in this edition of Afro Perspectives as we explore the career of Jonas Savimbi. Jonas Maleiro Savimbi was born on August the 3rd, 1934 at Munango in the Moxico province in southern Angola. His father, Lord Maleiro Savimbi, was the first black station master employed by the Benguela Railway. The family was constantly on the move due to the demands of Lord's work as a station master. Knowledge of the railway network came in handy for Jonas Savimbi at later stages of his career when planning targets for attack, but more of that later. Jonas Savimbi inherited his fiery oratory skills from his father, Lord, who was also working as a Protestant preacher part-time. Savimbi belonged to the Ovimbundu ethnic group, the largest in Angola. He was educated at a succession of mission schools, and he completed his 6th year of secondary school at the top of his class. In 1958, the missionaries awarded Savimbi a scholarship to study medicine at the University of Lisbon. Savimbi was also active in student politics and was, during his time at the University of Lisbon, he was under constant police harassment. Consequently, he was detained on 3 separate occasions by the Portuguese secret police, and for that reason he abandoned his studies at the University of Lisbon. Savimbi subsequently transferred to the Freiburg University in Switzerland, and then later on went to Lausanne University, where in 1965 he switched to political science. Although Savimbi only finished his studies with a master's degree, later on he would refer to himself as doctor. While Savimbi was abroad studying in the Belgian Congo, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, Holden Roberto started the Union of the Peoples of Angola, UPA, in 1957. an organization mainly representing the interests of the Bakongo ethnic group of northern Angola. In 1961, the UPA transformed itself into the National Front for the Liberation of Angola, the FNLA, and then in 1962 it formed a government in exile. Savimbi used his background as a member of Angola's largest ethnic group, the Ovimbundu, to get a top post in the FNLA. He became its Secretary General and Foreign Minister. In July 1964, at a meeting of the Organization of African Unity and at its summit in Cairo, Savimbi resigned from the FNLA. He publicly accused Holden Roberto of tribalism and working for the American intelligence services, the CIA. Savimbi charged that Roberto and the FNLA were incapable of developing a real struggle to liberate the country. Although, as we shall see later in the program, it would only take another 6 years, and Savimbi himself would later on collaborate with the Portuguese to derail Angola's transition to independence. Soon after his break with the FNLA, Savimbi approached the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA, with a proposal to integrate his group of dissidents in the MPLA itself. However, the deal collapsed because Savimbi insisted that as representative of Angola's largest ethnic group, the Ovimbundu, he was entitled to participate in the leadership of the MPLA itself. After the break with the FNLA and failure to get a position within the MPLA, Savimbi started contemplating on forming his own movement. Thus, in 1965, he went for military training in guerrilla tactics at Nanking Military Academy in China. Upon his return to Angola in the same year of 1965, Savimbi set up his own movement, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA. In December of 1966, UNITA launched its first major operation against the Benguela Railway. Although Savimbi lost 300 of his own guerrillas, he managed to close a route vital to the exports of copper from both the Zambian copper belt and the Zairean copper mines in Katanga. Although Savimbi projected himself as the genuine black power peasant leader, that did not stop him from signing a secret agreement with the Portuguese in the middle of 1971. The Portuguese referred to the deal as Operation Timber. In Operation Timber, Savimbi agreed to suspend military activity against the Portuguese armed forces. He agreed with the MPLA that the MPLA was the common enemy and was to be liquidated not only in the eastern regions but in the whole of Angola. On January 15, 1975, Jonas Savimbi, together with Holden Roberto representing the FNLA, Agostinho Neto for the MPLA, and the three met with representatives of the Portuguese in what is now known as the Alvo Accords. The three agreed to work together and then put in place a transitional government followed by elections and later on independence on the 11th of November 1975. However, before independence had become a reality, to the Americans it dawned on them that their favored client, the FNLA, would not win the elections. On the 26th of January, Holden Roberto received $300,000 in American dollars from the CIA based in Kinshasa and was given the go-ahead to attack the MPLA fighters in northern Angola. Thus, the deal to hold elections prior to independence had collapsed. A three-way fight ensued for the capital Luanda before independence could actually be realized. Savimbi's UNITA at this point was insignificant. The major conflict was the bitter fighting between the FNLA and the MPLA in and around the capital Luanda from March 1975 onwards. At the same time, in March of 1975, Savimbi met with the South African Defense Minister General Magnus Malan. Savimbi assured the South Africans that his goal was the same as theirs, to prevent the MPLA taking over in Luanda. Savimbi declared himself opposed to guerrilla warfare against white minority regimes, and the South African advisors began training his forces as well as supplying him with equipment. Meanwhile, the US had come to the conclusion that the client FNLA would not prevail over the MPLA. In July of 1975, the US National Security Council went ahead and allocated an additional 14 million American dollars. This time, Savimbi was allocated part of the funding. In October 1975, the South Africans responded to Savimbi's offer to join the conflict. They rolled into southern Angola with units of armored cars supported by air support. Together with the UNITA, they overran the few units of FAPLA, the armed wing of the MPLA, who were supported by a few Cuban advisors. At this juncture of the conflict, the MPLA called in support from the Cubans and managed to stop the South Africans 70 miles out of Luanda. The MPLA then went on to declare independence on 11th of November 1975. While the rest of Africa and the world recognized Angola as an independent state, the Americans and the South Africans, however, refused to recognize the MPLA government in Luanda. Recovering from their recent experience of setbacks in Vietnam, the Americans were keen to avoid another humiliating defeat. In 1976, the CIA scaled down its funding to UNITA. The American government outlawed the participation of Americans and funding of military activities in Angola. This law became known as the Clark Amendment. After UNITA's defeat, Jonas Savimbi and his forces withdrew to the bush and set up his headquarters at Jamba. UNITA operations were now concentrated on the provinces of Moxico, Bie, and Wambo. Savimbi wanted to stay out of reach of became the dominant recruitment tool. Savimbi used child soldiers, and even those in positions of leadership within UNITA were forced to work under threat of loss of their lives as well as those of their families. After passage of the Clark Amendment, it was illegal for Americans to support UNITA, as I have said earlier on. However, after the failure of Jimmy Carter to gain a second term as U.S. president, the new administration under Ronald Reagan came into power. It had other priorities, and the Clark Amendment was subsequently repealed by the American Congress in 1985. On the 3rd of January 1986, Jonas Savimbi visited the American President Ronald Reagan at the White House. While he was treated like a head of state, Savimbi was at the same time threatening to bomb oil rigs owned by American companies unless he got what he was asking for. Savimbi reassured the American president that UNITA was certain of victory. He asked for funding and Stinger missiles. In 1986 and 1987, the Americans supplied at least $30 million in American dollars in covert military aid to Savimbi, including the Stinger missiles he had earlier requested. However, in response to the Americans resuming support to Jonas Savimbi, the MPLA in October 1987 planned an offensive against Savimbi. They started off with attacking the town of Mavinga, which they reckoned would have cleared their way to Jamba, his headquarters. The South Africans provided artillery and armor support, and FAPLA, with the Soviet and Cuban advisors, was forced to withdraw northwards to the town of Quito Carnavale. The turning point at Quito Carnavale came when the Cubans decided to reinforce FAPLA with 1,500 soldiers. Savimbi's UNITA suffered 3,000 casualties, and the South Africans were forced to pull out of Angola by August of 1998. UNITA soldiers were reportedly weeping at the loss of South African support. On June 22, 1989, Zairean President Mobutu Sese Seko hosted 18 African heads of state at his palace in Guadolite, Zaire. A ceasefire was agreed to starting midnight on June the 24th, 1989. 1989. Savimbi had agreed to go into exile as part of the ceasefire agreement, but later denied having done so. Although the MPLA government calculated that without South African support, it would be easier to defeat Savimbi, they were mistaken. On 23 December 1989, the MPLA made a second attempt to retake the town of Mavinga and then head on to Savimbi's capital of Jamba. Its offensive later on fizzled out. Although Savimbi claimed victory in denying the MPLA victory, without South African support, he was exposed. On the side of the MPLA, the collapse of the Soviet Union on December 25, 1991, and the subsequent fall of communism in the Eastern Bloc led the MPLA to abandon its monopoly on power in Angola. It immediately allowed multi-party politics. On May the 31st of 1991, Savimbi faced his long-time nemesis José Eduardo dos Santos, and in the town of Lucesse in Portugal, he agreed to participate in elections. While at the same time campaigning for elections, in February of 1992, two of Savimbi's top generals warned that Savimbi was preparing for another war. These generals were Antonio da Costa Fernandes and Miguel Maria Nzau Puna, who later defected from UNITA and joined the government. In the election, Savimbi's fear of being upstaged by his own generals ran a solo campaign. He failed to beat his nemesis José Eduardo dos Santos in the first round. A second round was ordered. While waiting for the runoff, Savimbi pulled out, citing irregularities and fraud. The MPLA went on to win the elections, which everyone considered free and fair except Savimbi himself. In May 1993, the US government of Bill Clinton finally recognized President José Eduardo dos Santos and his MPLA government. This signaled the end of US support for Jonas Savimbi, yet it did not halt Savimbi's war. In order to instill terror in the population and undermine confidence in the government, Savimbi ordered that food supplies be targeted. Millions of landmines were laid in peasants' fields and transport lines were cut. As part of this destabilization effort, UNITA frequently attacked health clinics, schools, specifically terrorizing and killing medical workers and teachers. On September 7, 1983, a day now known by the UNITA faithful as Red September, Savimbi erected a giant stack of wood. Several women, widows of senior UNITA officials who Savimbi had earlier executed, were accused of practicing witchcraft and were burned alive. Those who had children, the children were also suffered the same fate. Although in 1994 UNITA signed a new peace accord, these attempts at peace were half-hearted. Savimbi himself did not attend the signing ceremony, sending his deputy instead, Eugenio Manavacola. He declined the presidency that was offered to him. Instead, Savimbi quickly launched an attack on the diamond-rich areas of northern Angola, establishing control of the region, and proceeded to wage the war almost entirely through the trade of diamonds for arms. Although the United Nations eventually imposed a ban on the purchase of UNITA diamonds in 1988, it came too late for peace. In the past, Savimbi's followers had showed their dissatisfaction by defecting to the government side or fleeing abroad. However, in 1998, his generals, led by Eugenio Manavacola, openly opposed Savimbi. They formed UNITA Renewal, and the government quickly indicated that it recognized the new splinter group as the real representative of UNITA. Despite his loss of status, Savimbi requested negotiations in March 2001, and he further indicated a willingness to accept the terms he had earlier rejected. However, fighting continued throughout 2001 and spilled into Zambia and Namibia. On the other hand, the government had put in place plans to capture Savimbi. Ironically, that operation was headed by a former UNITA general, General Geraldo Nunda. His troops continued to pursue Savimbi. On the 22nd of February 2002, Savimbi was killed. After Savimbi's death, a peace agreement between UNITA and the government was quickly signed in April of 2002. UNITA was represented by General Abre Mwengo Ukwachitembo, while from the government signed General Armando da Cruz Neto signed. Thus ended 27 years of civil war, which was only made possible by the death of Jonas Savimbi. Thank you for tuning in. If you found this version of Savimbi's life interesting, please drop your comments below and don't forget to subscribe. Follow me in the next episode as we look at the life of Chris Hani. Thank you. Bye.